The bride's white dress caught on a jagged fence post as Caroline Grant fled through the darkness, tearing silk that her father had paid 3 months' wages to import from Boston. But she didn't stop running until she heard the horses behind her. It was May 1883, and the Arizona Territory stretched endless and unforgiving under a sky just beginning to lighten with the threat of dawn. Caroline's lungs burned as she stumbled through the scrubland outside Kingman, her fancy wedding shoes already ruined by rocks and thorns. Behind her, she could hear men shouting, her father's voice carrying above the others, commanding them to find her before sunrise. Before the ceremony that would bind her to Marcus Thornton, a man 30 years her senior who had bought her like livestock with promises of water rights and cattle. She was 23 years old and had never felt more alone. The rocky outcropping appeared suddenly in the pre-dawn light, and Caroline threw herself behind it, pressing her back against the cool stone as she tried to quiet her ragged breathing. Her dark hair had fallen from its careful arrangement, tumbling wild around her shoulders. The voices grew closer, and she squeezed her eyes shut, praying to a God she wasn't sure listened to desperate women. "Miss, you better come with me right now if you want to live free." Caroline's eyes flew open. A man stood above her on the outcropping, silhouetted against the slowly brightening sky. He was tall and lean, with a wide-brimmed hat pushed back on his head. Before she could scream or run, he dropped down beside her with practiced ease and clamped a gentle but firm hand over her mouth. "I'm not going to hurt you," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. "But those men will find you in about 2 minutes if you stay here. My horse is just over that ridge. You have to trust me." Caroline stared into his eyes, trying to make out his features in the dim light. They were kind eyes, she thought, or at least not cruel ones. She could hear her father's men spreading out, getting closer. The stranger removed his hand slowly, waiting for her decision. "Why would you help me?" she whispered. "Because I know what it's like to run from something that feels like death." He held out his hand. "Name's Vincent Ortiz, and we need to go now." She took his hand. They ran low across the scrubland, Vincent guiding her with sure-footed confidence through terrain that looked identical in every direction to Caroline. True to his word, a sturdy paint horse waited beyond the ridge, already saddled. Vincent mounted in one fluid motion and pulled Caroline up behind him before she could protest. "Hold on tight," he said. And then they were flying across the desert as the sun crept above the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful if Caroline's heart hadn't been hammering so hard she thought it might burst. They rode hard for what felt like hours, but was probably less than one. Vincent guided the horse through arroyos and around rock formations, clearly knowing the land intimately. Finally, as the sun climbed higher and the day's heat began to settle over the territory, he slowed the horse and turned them toward a small ranch house nestled against a hillside. "This is my place," Vincent said as they approached. "Not much, but it's mine. No one's going to find you here without my permission." Caroline slid off the horse on shaking legs, her fine dress coated in dust and sweat. Now, in full daylight, she could see her rescuer clearly for the first time. Vincent Ortiz was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that needed cutting and sun-bronzed skin that spoke of long hours outdoors. His face was strong-featured and honest, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. He wore simple working clothes, a cotton shirt and worn denim trousers, with a gun belt slung low on his hips. "Thank you," Caroline said, and was mortified when her voice broke on the words. "I don't know how to repay you." Vincent swung down from his horse and began unsaddling it, his movements efficient and practiced. Don't need repayment for doing what's right. Why don't you go on inside and wash up? There's a pump in the kitchen and some clothes that might fit you. My sister left some things here before she married and moved to California. The ranch house was small but well kept, just 3 rooms built solid against the harsh climate. The main room held a wood stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a worn sofa that had seen better days. Caroline found the kitchen pump and splashed cool water on her face, watching rusty streaks run down her arms where the dress had left smudges. In the bedroom, she found a simple cotton dress hanging in a wardrobe, faded blue but clean and practical. It fit reasonably well, and Caroline felt almost human again once she'd changed and braided her hair. Vincent was cooking something on the stove when she emerged, the smell of coffee and bacon making her stomach clench with sudden hunger. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. "Sit down," he said without looking up. "You need food." They ate in silence at first, Caroline too exhausted and overwhelmed to know what to say. Vincent didn't push, just ate his own breakfast and periodically refilled her coffee cup. Finally, when the food had restored some of her strength and the silence had stretched long enough, Caroline spoke. "My father arranged for me to marry Marcus Thornton this morning. Do you know him?" Vincent's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I know of him. He owns the biggest ranch in the territory, has his fingers in every business in Kingman. Not a kind man. He's 53 years old and has buried 2 wives already," Caroline said, her hands clenching around her coffee cup. "My father doesn't care. Thornton offered him water rights and a partnership, and my father sees me as nothing more than a business transaction. I told him I wouldn't marry that man, that I'd rather die, but he locked me in my room yesterday. I climbed out the window during the night." "That took courage," Vincent said quietly. "That took desperation." Caroline met his eyes across the table. "But they won't stop looking for me. My father is proud, and Marcus Thornton isn't the type of man who likes being refused anything. They'll search every ranch, every town. I have no money, no horse, nowhere to go. I've just delayed the inevitable." Vincent was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it held answers. When he looked up, his dark eyes were serious and determined. "There is one thing that would stop them," he said slowly. "If you were already married. Thornton wouldn't want another man's wife, not when there are plenty of other desperate fathers willing to sell their daughters. Your father might rage, but he couldn't force you if you were legally bound to someone else." Caroline's breath caught. "I don't understand what you're suggesting." "I'm suggesting you marry me instead." Vincent held up a hand as she started to protest. "Not a real marriage, not in any way that matters. Just on paper. We'd go into Prescott. It's bigger than Kingman and far enough away that news travels slow. We get married by the justice of the peace there, and then you're protected. Once things settle down, once Thornton has found some other poor woman and your father has gotten over his anger, we can quietly get the marriage annulled. You'd be free to go wherever you want, do whatever you want." "Why would you do that?" Caroline asked, searching his face for ulterior motives. "You don't even know me. What do you gain from this?" Vincent smiled then, a sad sort of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "My parents came to this territory when there was nothing here but desert and dreams. They built this ranch from dust and determination. My father used to say that the only thing that mattered was whether you could look at yourself in the mirror and be proud of what you saw. I can't be proud if I let a woman be forced into a marriage that's nothing more than legalized slavery. But marriage to you would be the same thing, wouldn't it? Another man making decisions about my life." "No," Vincent said firmly. "Because I'd be offering you a choice, and I'd be promising you freedom at the end of it. You'd stay here as long as you needed to, safe and unmolested. I'd expect nothing from you except maybe help with cooking since I'm terrible at it. And when you were ready to leave, I'd sign whatever papers needed signing and wish you well." Caroline studied him, this strange cowboy who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't quite finished praying. Every instinct she'd honed in 23 years of reading people told her that Vincent Ortiz was genuine, but trusting those instincts felt dangerous when she'd been wrong about so much else in her life. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Fair enough, but we should decide soon. The longer you stay here unmarried, the more danger we're both in if they find you." They spent the rest of the morning in careful companionship. Vincent showed Caroline around the small ranch, explaining how he ran 30 head of cattle on the property and did occasional work for neighboring ranchers to supplement his income. He'd inherited the place when his parents died of fever 3 years prior, and his sister Alina had lived with him until she'd met and married a man from California who'd come west looking for opportunity. "You ever feel lonely out here by yourself?" Caroline asked as they stood watching the cattle graze in a small canyon. "Sometimes," Vincent admitted, "but lonely is better than being stuck in a situation that makes you miserable. I learned that from watching my sister in a courtship with a man here in Kingman. He seemed fine on the surface, but he had a mean streak. She was trying to convince herself to marry him because she thought it was time, thought that's what she was supposed to do. I told her she should wait, that the right person would come along. She called me a romantic fool. But she took your advice, she did. And 6 months later she met Thomas and knew within a week that he was the one. They're happy now, running a mercantile in Sacramento. She writes me letters telling me I was right." He grinned. "I'll never let her forget it." Caroline laughed, surprising herself. It felt strange to laugh after the terror of the night before, but something about Vincent's easy manner made her feel safe enough to let her guard down. As the day wore on, Caroline found herself watching Vincent as he worked. He moved with an easy confidence, whether he was repairing a fence or hauling water for the cattle. He was patient with the animals, kind in his words, and never once looked at her with the possessive hunger she'd seen in Marcus Thornton's eyes the few times they'd met. Vincent looked at her like she was a person, not a prize to be won. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the desert in a spectacular display of orange and purple, Caroline made her decision. "I'll marry you," she said quietly, "if the offer still stands." Vincent turned to look at her, his expression serious. "It stands. But I want you to understand something, Caroline. This is your choice. If you change your mind tomorrow or the next day, or even when we're standing in front of the justice of the peace, you just say so. I'll help you find another way. You're not trapped with me." "I know," Caroline said, and realized she meant it. "That's why I'm saying yes." They left for Prescott before dawn the next morning, taking a route that avoided Kingman entirely. Vincent had another horse, a sweet-tempered mare named Daisy, and Caroline rode her while Vincent took his paint horse, whose name she'd learned was Cisco. The journey to Prescott would take most of the day, and Vincent had packed supplies and bedrolls in case they needed to camp before reaching the town. The Arizona Territory spread around them in vast stretches of beauty and danger. They passed through valleys studded with saguaro cacti standing like sentinels, crossed dry creek beds that would run wild with water during the summer monsoons, and climbed rocky hills that offered views for miles in every direction. Vincent pointed out landmarks and told her stories about the land, his love for this harsh territory evident in every word. "My father used to say that the desert doesn't give anything easily, but what it does give is worth keeping," Vincent said, as they paused to water the horses at a natural spring. He meant the land, the way it teaches you to value every drop of rain and every moment of shade. But I think he also meant the people who choose to stay here. We're all stubborn enough to love a place that tries to kill us half the time. I've always loved it too, Caroline admitted. My father came here from Missouri when I was 10 years old, dragging my mother and me with him. My mother hated it. She died 2 years later, and I always wondered if it was partly from heartbreak at losing her green hills and gentle rain. But I never felt that way. I loved the bigness of it, the way you could see storms coming from miles away, the sunsets that looked like God was showing off. Your mother passed when you were 12, Vincent asked gently. Yes. After that, it was just my father and me. He worked hard, built up a decent ranch, but he was always angry. Angry at the land for taking my mother, angry at me for looking like her, angry at the world for not giving him more than he had. When Marcus Thornton made his offer, I think my father saw it as his chance to finally win, to finally be somebody important. He didn't care what it cost me. They rode in silence for a while after that, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need filling. Caroline found herself relaxing in the saddle, her body adjusting to the rhythm of Daisy's gait. She'd ridden before, but never on a journey like this, never with this sense of purpose and possibility. They reached Prescott as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. The town was considerably larger than Kingman, bustling with activity as people went about their business. Prescott had become the territorial capital just a few years prior, and it showed in the solid buildings and air of importance that pervaded the streets. Vincent led them to a small boarding house on the edge of town, run by a Mexican woman named Mrs. Rivera, who greeted Vincent like an old friend. They spoke in rapid Spanish for a moment, Vincent gesturing to Caroline, and then Mrs. Rivera was ushering them inside with warm smiles and a stream of words that Caroline couldn't follow. "She's going to give you a room for the night," Vincent explained. "Tomorrow morning, we'll go to the justice of the peace. I told her you're my intended, and she's already planning what I'm sure will be an enormous breakfast to celebrate." Caroline was given a small but clean room with a real bed, a luxury after the sofa she'd slept on the night before at Vincent's ranch. She washed up using the basin and pitcher provided, changed into the other dress Vincent's sister had left behind, a simple brown cotton with small white flowers, and tried to calm the butterflies in her stomach. She was getting married tomorrow, to a man she'd known for barely 2 days. It was insane. It was necessary. It was the only choice that felt like her own. That night, Mrs. Rivera fed them a feast of chicken and rice, beans and fresh tortillas with flan for dessert that melted on Caroline's tongue. Vincent chatted easily with Mrs. Rivera in both English and Spanish, including Caroline in the conversation and translating when needed. Watching him, Caroline realized he was more educated than his simple rancher appearance suggested. He spoke well, read the newspapers Mrs. Rivera offered him, and had opinions on everything from territorial politics to the best way to treat a horse for colic. "How did you learn to speak Spanish so well?" Caroline asked when Mrs. Rivera had cleared the dishes and left them alone in the small dining room. "My mother was Mexican," Vincent said. "From Sonora, originally. She met my father when he was down there buying cattle. He always said she was the prettiest thing he'd ever seen, and he about broke his neck trying to impress her. She made him learn Spanish before she'd agree to marry him. Said if he wanted to marry into her family, he'd better be able to talk to them. And she taught you everything she knew, how to speak, how to cook, how to see the world as bigger than just one way of doing things. My father was Irish, stubborn as they come, but he loved my mother enough to embrace her world too. That's how it should be, I think. Love shouldn't ask you to give up who you are. His words hung in the air between them, and Caroline felt something shift in her chest. This was supposed to be a business arrangement, a marriage of convenience to protect her from a worse fate. But Vincent kept saying things that made her think he understood something essential about what partnership should look like, something her own father had never grasped. "You must miss them," she said softly, "your parents, every day, but I try to live in a way that would make them proud. That's the best memorial I can give them." The next morning dawned clear and bright. Mrs. Rivera insisted on doing Caroline's hair, braiding it in an elaborate style and tucking in small white flowers she'd somehow procured. The brown dress had been pressed and looked almost elegant in the morning light. Caroline stared at herself in the small mirror in her room and barely recognized the woman looking back. She'd expected to look terrified, but instead she looked determined. Vincent was waiting in the parlor, wearing clothes she hadn't seen before. A clean white shirt, dark trousers, and a vest that had been carefully maintained. He'd shaved and combed his hair, and Caroline felt her breath catch a little at how handsome he looked. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and offered his arm. The justice of the peace was a stern-looking man named Judge Morrison who had an office above the Land Claims Department. He looked over their paperwork, asked the required questions, and showed no particular interest in their answers. Caroline wondered how many marriages he'd performed where the parties barely knew each other, where desperation or convenience drew people together in this wild territory where civilization sat lightly on the land. "Do you, Vincent Michael Ortiz, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." Vincent's voice was steady, his hand warm as it held hers. "And do you, Caroline Elizabeth Grant, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Caroline looked into Vincent's eyes, those kind, dark eyes that had offered her a choice when she'd had none. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss the bride." Vincent leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wanted to, but Caroline didn't pull back. She let him kiss her, a brief and gentle press of lips that somehow felt more intimate than anything she'd experienced before. When he pulled away, his eyes held a question, and she answered with a small smile. They were married. She was Caroline Ortiz now, protected by a name and a piece of paper from men who would have owned her. As they walked out of the judge's office into the bright May morning, Caroline felt something she hadn't felt in months: hope. The ride back to Vincent's ranch took a different kind of silence than the ride out had. They were married now, bound together by law if not by love, and the weight of that reality settled over both of them. But it wasn't an uncomfortable weight, Caroline thought. More like putting on a coat that didn't quite fit yet, but might, with time and wear. When they arrived back at the ranch in the late afternoon, Vincent helped her down from Daisy and stood for a moment with his hands on her waist, looking uncertain for the first time since she'd met him. "I want you to know that nothing has to change," he said. "You'll take the bedroom, I'll sleep out here on the sofa. You're safe here, Caroline. I meant what I said about this being on paper only." "I know," Caroline said, "and I'm grateful. But Vincent, we are married now. We're going to be living together, at least for a while. Maybe we could try to be friends too." His smile was like sunrise. "I'd like that." Over the following weeks, they settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Caroline took over the cooking, discovering that Vincent hadn't been exaggerating about his lack of skill in that area. She baked bread, fried chicken, made stews and pies from the supplies Vincent brought back from his occasional trips to town. She tended a small garden that Vincent's mother had planted years ago, coaxing vegetables from the reluctant soil. Vincent worked the ranch, riding out each morning to check on the cattle, repair fences, and maintain the property. Sometimes Caroline rode out with him, and he taught her things he'd learned from his father about reading the land, about predicting weather, about treating a cow with bloat or a horse with a stone bruise. He was a patient teacher, never condescending, always willing to explain things as many times as needed. In the evenings, they sat on the porch and talked. Vincent told her about his childhood, about learning to ride before he could walk properly, about his sister's mischievous nature and his parents' deep love for each other. Caroline shared her own stories, about growing up in Missouri, about the journey west, about her mother's gentle nature and her father's gradual transformation into a bitter, grasping man. "You think he's still looking for me?" Caroline asked one evening as they watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Probably not actively," Vincent said. "Word travels. Someone from Prescott likely mentioned seeing us, and by now your father knows you're married. He'll be angry, but there's nothing he can do about it legally. You're my wife now." He said the last words carefully, as if testing their weight. And Marcus Thornton, men like him don't mourn for long. He wanted a young wife to show off and give him heirs. There are other young women whose fathers owe him money or need his influence. He'll find one. Caroline shivered despite the warm evening air, thinking about some other girl being forced into the fate she'd escaped. Vincent noticed and stood, retrieving a blanket from inside and draping it around her shoulders. "You can't save everyone," he said gently, sitting back down beside her, closer than before. "You can only save yourself and hope that by doing so you show others it's possible." As the summer heat intensified, Caroline found herself more and more grateful for the shelter Vincent had provided. But it was more than just physical shelter, she realized. In his quiet, steady presence, she'd found emotional shelter too. Vincent never raised his voice, never made demands, never looked at her with anything but respect and growing warmth. He made her laugh with stories about his horses' personalities and his own mishaps learning to ranch. He listened when she talked about her dreams of maybe, someday, opening a bakery or a boarding house of her own, something that would be hers and no one else's. One brutally hot afternoon in July, Caroline was in the kitchen trying to keep cool while making dinner when Vincent came in from working on the windmill, his shirt soaked with sweat. "The bearing is completely shot," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "I'm going to have to go into Prescott tomorrow to get a replacement. Without that windmill, watering the cattle is going to be brutal." "I'll come with you," Caroline said, and then paused. She hadn't been to any town since Prescott in May. The thought of seeing people, of potentially being recognized, sent anxiety shooting through her. Vincent studied her face. "You don't have to. I know being out in public is risky, but Caroline, we are married. Legally, legitimately married. No one can force you to leave me or go back to your father. Maybe it's time to stop hiding and start living." He was right, and Caroline knew it. She couldn't hide on this ranch forever, no matter how safe it felt. She was Caroline Ortiz now, a married woman with every right to go where she pleased. "Okay," she said, squaring her shoulders. "We'll go together." They left early the next morning to beat the worst of the heat. Caroline wore her brown dress and a bonnet to protect her face from the sun. As they rode, Vincent told her about the supplies they needed to pick up, and mentioned stopping by Mrs. Rivera's boarding house for lunch. Prescott was busy when they arrived, people going about their business under the unforgiving sun. Caroline felt exposed as they walked down the main street toward the hardware store, certain that everyone was staring at her. But no one paid them any particular attention. They were just another married couple running errands, unremarkable and uninteresting. At the hardware store, while Vincent was discussing bearings with the proprietor, Caroline wandered to the front window and looked out at the street. That's when she saw him. Marcus Thornton, climbing out of an expensive carriage, helping down a young blonde woman who couldn't have been more than 18. The girl looked terrified, and Thornton's hand on her arm was possessive, controlling. Caroline must have made a sound because suddenly Vincent was beside her, his hand on her back, protective and warm. "That's him?" he asked quietly. "Yes, with his new acquisition, apparently. She looks like a scared rabbit. I looked the same way when he came to dinner at my father's house." Caroline watched as Thornton led the girl into a restaurant, his hand never leaving her arm. "I wish there was something I could do for her." "There isn't," Vincent said firmly. "I know that's hard to hear, but it's true. She has to save herself just like you did. All you can do is live your life in a way that proves it's possible." They had lunch at Mrs. Rivera's, who fussed over them and insisted on serving them her special mole that she only made for family. She asked Caroline questions about the ranch, about married life, treating her like Vincent's real wife and not the fake arrangement Caroline sometimes forgot this was supposed to be. On the ride home, Caroline was quiet, her mind still on that scared girl in Thornton's grip. Vincent didn't push her to talk, just rode beside her in companionable silence. When they finally reached the ranch as evening was falling, Caroline felt the tension drain from her shoulders. This place had become home without her quite realizing when it had happened. "Thank you for today," she said as Vincent helped her down from Daisy. "For being there when I saw him, for understanding why it upset me." "Always," Vincent said simply, and the word felt like a promise. As summer shifted toward autumn, something began to change between them. It was subtle at first, in the way Vincent's hand would linger on hers when he helped her up onto her horse, in the way Caroline found herself watching him work with a flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with fear or anxiety. The carefully maintained distance they'd preserved began to feel less like safety and more like an obstacle to something they both wanted, but were afraid to name. One evening in late September, as they sat on the porch watching a spectacular sunset, Caroline finally found the courage to speak. "Vincent, can I ask you something personal, always? When you offered to marry me, you said it would only be on paper, that we'd get it annulled when things settled down. But it's been 4 months now. Have you thought any more about that?" Vincent was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the desert painted gold and red by the dying light. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. "I've thought about it. But Caroline, I don't want you to feel trapped or obligated. If you want to leave, if you want your freedom, I'll sign whatever needs signing. That was the deal. That's not what I'm asking." Caroline turned to face him, her heart pounding. "I'm asking whether you still want the annulment." Vincent met her eyes then, and what she saw in his gaze made her breath catch. "No," he said quietly. "I don't. I haven't wanted it for a long time now, but this has to be your choice, Caroline. I won't trap you the way Thornton would have. I won't use law or obligation or anything else to keep you somewhere you don't want to be." "I want to be here," Caroline said, and realized it was the truest thing she'd ever spoken. "I want to be your wife, Vincent. Really your wife. Not because I'm running from something, but because I'm running toward something, toward you." Vincent's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with heartbreaking gentleness. "Are you sure? Because once I kiss you, really kiss you, I'm not sure I'll be able to stop wanting you." "Then don't stop," Caroline whispered. He kissed her as the sun disappeared below the horizon, and it was nothing like the chaste kiss they'd shared in the judge's office. This kiss was heat and promise. 4 months of restrained desire finally given permission to exist. Caroline wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with everything she'd been holding inside. All the growing affection and respect, and want that had bloomed during their careful courtship of domestic routine and shared laughter. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Vincent rested his forehead against hers. "I fell in love with you," he said simply. "Somewhere between teaching you to read weather signs and watching you sing while you baked bread, I fell completely in love with you." "I love you too," Caroline said, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. "I think I have for a while now. I was just afraid to admit it, afraid that if I wanted this too much it would be taken away." "I'm not going anywhere," Vincent promised. "And neither are you. We're building a life together, Caroline. A real one." That night, Caroline didn't sleep on the bed in the bedroom while Vincent took the sofa. They went to bed together as husband and wife in truth, not just in name, and in Vincent's arms. Caroline finally understood what her mother had meant when she used to say that love should feel like coming home. The next morning, Caroline woke wrapped in Vincent's embrace, his steady heartbeat under her ear. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes in golden shafts. Vincent stirred and pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Good morning, wife," he murmured, and the word held new meaning now. "Good morning, husband," Caroline replied and felt him smile against her hair. They spent that day working the ranch together as they had for months, but everything felt different now. When Vincent helped Caroline onto her horse, he stole a kiss. When they stopped to water the cattle, he pulled her close and told her she was beautiful. When they returned to the house for dinner, he wrapped his arms around her from behind as she cooked and told her he loved her until the words felt like breathing. As autumn progressed toward winter, they settled into their new reality as a couple truly in love. Vincent began talking about expanding the ranch, about buying more cattle, about building on to the house to make room for a future family. Caroline encouraged his dreams and shared her own, about maybe raising chickens, about planting a bigger garden, about making the ranch not just survive but thrive. In November, Caroline's suspicions were confirmed by a doctor in Prescott. She was pregnant, the baby due to arrive in late spring. Vincent's face when she told him was incandescent with joy. He picked her up and spun her around despite her laughing protests, then set her down carefully as if she were made of spun glass. "We're going to have a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "A family." "You've given me everything, Caroline." "We've given each other everything," she corrected and kissed him. The winter was mild that year, and Caroline's pregnancy progressed easily. Vincent was attentive but not smothering, helping with the heavy work, but respecting her insistence that she wasn't made of porcelain. They spent long evenings by the fire, Vincent's hand on her growing belly, feeling their child move and kick and make his or her presence known. It was during one of these quiet evenings in February that someone knocked on the door. Vincent tensed immediately, his hand going to the gun he'd taken to keeping closer since Caroline's pregnancy had become obvious. Visitors were rare, and unexpected ones even more so. He moved to the door while Caroline stood, her heart racing. "Who is it?" Vincent called. "It's Henry Grant. I'm looking for my daughter." Caroline's hand flew to her mouth, her father. After all these months he'd come. Vincent looked at her, his expression questioning. She nodded slowly. Hiding wouldn't solve anything, and she wasn't that frightened girl running through the desert anymore. Vincent opened the door but didn't step back to allow entry. Henry Grant stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking older than Caroline remembered. His face was weathered and worn, his hair grayer than it had been in May. "Mr. Grant," Vincent said coolly, "what brings you to my ranch? I heard my daughter was here. I'd like to speak with her." "That's up to her." Vincent glanced back at Caroline. "Do you want to talk to him?" Caroline stepped forward, one hand protectively on her belly. Her father's eyes went to the obvious swell of her pregnancy, and something flickered across his face that might have been regret. "I'm here," she said quietly. "What do you want?" Henry Grant seemed to struggle for words. Finally, he said, "I wanted to see if you were all right, to apologize if you'll let me." "You can come in," Caroline said, surprising herself, "but only if you're civil. This is my home and you'll respect my husband." They sat awkwardly in the main room, Henry Grant looking out of place in his fine clothes in the simple ranch house. Vincent made coffee, staying close to Caroline, protective but not interfering. "I made a mistake," Henry finally said, the words seeming to cost him. "I was so focused on what I thought would secure our future that I didn't think about what you wanted or needed. Your mother would have been ashamed of me." "Yes," Caroline said simply, "she would have been. I heard you married." Henry looked at Vincent. "To a rancher. Word is he's a good man, treats you well, and now there's a baby coming." "There is, and Vincent is a very good man. He gave me a choice when you tried to take all my choices away." Henry flinched but nodded. I know what I did was wrong, Caroline. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I'm not sure I deserve it. But you're my daughter, my only child, and I needed you to know that I'm sorry, that I see now what I couldn't see then." Caroline felt Vincent's hand find hers, steady and supportive. She looked at her father, this man who had raised her and betrayed her, and felt a complicated tangle of emotions. Anger, yes, but also a faint echo of the love she'd once felt for him before her mother died, and he'd become someone she didn't recognize. "I appreciate you coming here to say that," she said finally. "And maybe in time we can rebuild something, but my life is here now with Vincent. This ranch, this baby, this future. You can be part of it if you can accept that, accept him. But if you can't, then it's better we part ways now." Henry looked between them at their joined hands, at the way Vincent stayed close to Caroline like a shield and a support. Then he nodded slowly. "I can accept it. I want to accept it if you'll let me try." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. They talked for another hour, carefully, about surface things at first, and then gradually deeper. Henry told them that Marcus Thornton had indeed married the young blonde woman Caroline had seen, and that she'd run away after only 3 weeks. The scandal had damaged Thornton's reputation, and he'd left the territory for California, claiming business opportunities. "Good," Caroline said fiercely. "I hope every woman he tries to buy runs as far and fast as she can." When Henry finally left, promising to visit again in a few months, Caroline felt exhausted but lighter somehow. Vincent held her as she cried, releasing months of tension and pain and complicated feelings about the man who was her father but had failed so badly at fatherhood. "You were so strong," Vincent murmured into her hair. "I'm proud of you." "I had you beside me," Caroline said. "That made all the difference." Caroline went into labor on a warm May morning, almost exactly a year after she'd fled into the desert in a torn wedding dress. Vincent rode hard to bring the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Chen, who had delivered half the babies in the territory. The labor was long but not complicated, and as the sun set on that May evening, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that made both his parents laugh through their tears. "He's perfect," Vincent breathed, watching in awe as Caroline held their tiny son against her chest. "You're perfect." "Look what we made, Caroline." They named him James Vincent Ortiz, after Vincent's father. Jamie, as they quickly began calling him, had his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, and from the beginning showed a stubborn streak that promised trouble ahead. Henry Grant came to meet his grandson 2 weeks after Jamie's birth, bringing a hand-carved cradle that he'd made himself. He held his grandson with tears streaming down his weathered face and apologized to Caroline again for almost destroying her chance at this happiness. "I'm glad you found this," he said, looking around at the ranch, at Vincent playing with Jamie's tiny fingers, at the clear evidence of love and life being built in this simple place. "I'm glad you had the courage to run, and that you found someone worth running to." As the months passed and Jamie grew, Caroline found herself more content than she'd ever imagined possible. The ranch prospered under their joint efforts. Vincent bought more cattle and contracted to supply beef to restaurants in Prescott and Kingman. Caroline started baking bread and pies to sell in town, using her mother's recipes and techniques she developed herself. Money was never plentiful, but it was steady, and more importantly, it was theirs. Elena, Vincent's sister, came to visit when Jamie was 6 months old, bringing her own new baby, a daughter named Rosa. The two women became instant friends, and Elena told Caroline that she'd never seen her brother so happy. "He was always so serious after our parents died," Elena said as they watched Vincent toss Jamie in the air, making the baby shriek with laughter. "Like he'd forgotten how to just enjoy life, but you brought that back to him. You gave him a reason to build toward the future instead of just maintaining what was." "He saved my life," Caroline said simply. "He gave me the freedom to choose, and I chose him. I'll never stop being grateful for that." "It wasn't just gratitude that put that ring on your finger or that baby in your arms," Elena said wisely. "You love him. Anyone can see it." "More than I thought it was possible to love anyone," Caroline admitted. When Jamie was a year old, they held a small celebration at the ranch. Henry Grant came, bringing a hand-carved rocking horse. Mrs. Rivera came from Prescott with enough food to feed an army. A few neighboring ranchers and their families attended, people who had accepted Caroline and Vincent as part of the community. As Caroline watched her son take his first wobbling steps toward his father's waiting arms, as she felt the community around them and the love that permeated every corner of her life, she thought about the scared girl in the torn wedding dress running through the desert. She'd been running from one future and hadn't known she was running toward a better one. Vincent had given her a choice, but in the end, she'd chosen him every day since. Not because she had to, but because he'd shown her what love could look like when it was based on respect and partnership and genuine affection. That night, after the guests had left and Jamie was asleep in his cradle, Vincent and Caroline sat on their porch as they had countless times before. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "Do you ever regret it?" Vincent asked quietly. "Marrying me instead of running somewhere far away where no one knew you?" Caroline lifted her head to look at him, at this man who had become her everything. "Not for a single second. You offered me your name when I needed protection, but you gave me so much more than that. You gave me a home, a family, a future. You gave me love without conditions. How could I possibly regret that?" "I'm the one who should be grateful," Vincent said, pulling her closer. "You've made me happier than I knew how to be. Every morning I wake up and see you beside me. I think about how lucky I am that you chose to run in my direction that morning." "Maybe it was fate," Caroline said with a smile. "Maybe I was always meant to find you." "Then I'll thank fate every day for the rest of my life." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The desert wind whispered through the scrubland, carrying the scent of creosote and possibility. And on that small ranch carved out of hardship and determination, two people who had found each other in desperation had built something lasting out of choice and love. The following years brought more children. A daughter named Maria Elena, born 2 years after Jamie, who had her father's smile and a willful nature that kept them constantly on their toes. Then twin boys, Daniel and Samuel, who arrived when Jamie was 5, doubling the chaos and joy in the household overnight. The ranch expanded as Vincent had dreamed. They hired help as needed, young men looking for work and learning opportunities. Vincent taught them what his father had taught him, about respecting the land and the animals, about hard work and integrity. Caroline's baking business grew until she was supplying several establishments in both Prescott and Kingman. She'd even started teaching other women her techniques, holding informal classes in her kitchen where she shared not just recipes, but the independence that came from having your own income. Henry Grant became a fixture in their lives, a doting grandfather who split his time between his own ranch and theirs. He'd sold off most of his cattle and lived more simply now, focused more on relationships than acquisitions. His presence in their lives had healed something in Caroline, not erasing the pain of what he'd tried to do, but allowing them to build something new on top of those scars. When Jamie was 7 years old, he asked the question that Caroline had been expecting for a while. "Mama, why doesn't Uncle Henry have the same last name as you?" Caroline looked at Vincent, who nodded encouragingly. They'd agreed to always be honest with their children about how their marriage had begun. "Because when I married your father, I changed my name from Grant to Ortiz," Caroline explained. "Uncle Henry was my father when my name was Grant, and he's still my father now. But you call him Henry, not Papa. That's because we had some hard times together, and it feels more comfortable this way. But he loves me, and he loves all of you very much." Jamie seemed to accept this, as children often did, taking complex adult situations in stride. Later, when he was older, they would tell him the fuller story, about his mother's courage and his father's kindness, about how love could grow from the strangest circumstances. The years flowed like water. Jamie grew tall and strong, taking after his father with an aptitude for working with horses. Maria Elena developed a sharp business sense that had Caroline predicting she'd one day run an empire. The twins were inseparable, always getting into mischief together, and then using identical innocent expressions to try to avoid consequences. Through it all, Caroline and Vincent's love deepened and matured. They had disagreements, of course, moments of frustration and misunderstanding. But they'd learned how to fight fair, how to listen, how to choose each other even when it was difficult. Every night, they still sat on that porch when weather permitted, talking about their days, making plans, simply being together. On their 10th anniversary, Vincent surprised Caroline by taking her back to Prescott for a weekend alone, leaving the children in the capable hands of Mrs. Rivera and Henry. They stayed at a proper hotel, ate at nice restaurants, and Vincent presented her with a beautiful silver necklace he'd had specially made. "It's not much," he said as he fastened it around her neck. "But I wanted you to have something that showed how much these 10 years have meant to me." "It's perfect," Caroline said, touching the delicate chain. "But Vincent, you've given me everything that matters. This life we've built, our children, your love. I'm the richest woman in the territory." That night, as they lay in the unfamiliar hotel bed, Vincent held her close and said, "You know what I remember most clearly from that morning? When I saw you hiding behind that rock, looking terrified, I thought she's going to run from me too. But you didn't. You trusted me. That trust was the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." "You earned it," Caroline said simply. "From that very first moment, you earned it." When Caroline was 35, her father died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 70. She mourned him, the complicated man who had failed her and then tried to make amends, who had been there for her children even when he'd almost destroyed her chance at having them. At the funeral, she spoke about redemption and second chances, about how love sometimes meant forgiving the unforgivable, not for them but for yourself. My father made terrible mistakes, she told the small gathering, but he owned them and tried to do better. In the end, that's all any of us can do. Make mistakes, learn from them, and try to be better tomorrow than we were yesterday. After the funeral, Vincent held her as she cried for the father who had been and the father who might have been if grief hadn't broken him. He loved you, Vincent said. In his own flawed way, he loved you, and he died knowing you were happy and safe. That's not nothing, Caroline. The years continued to pass, bringing grandchildren and gray hair, accomplishments and losses, the full rich tapestry of a life well lived. Jamie married a rancher's daughter from Prescott and gave them 2 grandsons. Maria Elena went to California for school and came back with a degree in business and a husband who was smart enough to appreciate her fierce intelligence. The twins, true to form, decided to go into business together, opening a horse training operation that quickly became renowned throughout the territory. When Caroline was 50 and Vincent 53, they found themselves alone in their ranch house again, the children grown and gone to their own lives. On a warm May evening, they sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before, watching the sunset paint the desert in familiar colors. "It's been 30 years, Caroline said quietly. 30 years since I ran into the desert in that ridiculous wedding dress." "Best morning of my life," Vincent said, pulling her close. "The morning I found you. The morning you saved me." "We saved each other," Vincent corrected. "I was so lonely, Caroline, before you. I had the ranch and I had my routines, but I didn't have purpose. You gave me that. You gave me a reason to build something that would last." Caroline looked around at the ranch they'd expanded and improved over 3 decades. The house had been added onto several times, growing with their family. The barn was solid and well maintained. The cattle grazed on good grass, and the horses in the corral were testament to years of careful breeding. But more than the physical evidence of their work, there was the legacy of their children and grandchildren, the community they'd been part of building, the lives they'd touched. "I think we did build something that will last," Caroline said. "Not just the ranch, but the example of what marriage can be, what partnership can be. Every time Maria Elena stands up for herself in a business meeting, every time Jamie treats his wife like an equal partner, that's our legacy. We showed them what real love looks like." "You showed me what real love looks like," Vincent said, turning her face toward his. "Every single day for 30 years you've shown me." They kissed as the sun disappeared below the horizon, and it felt both exactly like that first real kiss on this porch and completely different, layered now with decades of history and devotion. In the years that followed, Caroline and Vincent settled into the comfortable rhythms of older age. They still worked the ranch, though they hired more help and took more time to simply enjoy the life they'd built. They traveled some, visiting Alena in California and exploring the new places that were springing up as the territory grew and changed. Arizona achieved statehood in 1912, and they celebrated with champagne and stories about the wild early days when law had been more suggestion than rule. They watched their grandchildren grow, seeing echoes of themselves in those young faces. They attended christenings and weddings and graduations. They gave advice when asked and stayed quiet when not. They loved watching their children parent their own children, seeing the lessons they taught passed down another generation. On their 40th anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a massive celebration. Jamie and Maria Elena had organized everything, bringing in food and music and decorations. There were nearly 40 people there, all connected to Caroline and Vincent by blood or love, all gathered to honor a marriage that had started as a desperate bargain and grown into something legendary in the family. As Caroline stood surrounded by her children and grandchildren, Vincent's arm around her waist, she thought about that terrified girl running through the desert. She wished she could go back and tell her younger self that everything was going to be okay, that the cowboy who would hide her would become the love of her life, that the name he offered would become the name she carried with pride. But then again, she thought, maybe that girl needed to run blindly into the darkness, needed to trust without knowing where that trust would lead, needed to take that leap of faith. Because without fear, there couldn't be courage. And Caroline's story was one of courage, of choosing to believe in kindness when she'd been given every reason not to, of choosing to love when love felt dangerous. Vincent must have sensed her emotional moment because he pulled her closer and whispered in her ear, "What are you thinking about?" "About how lucky I am," Caroline said simply. "About how one terrible night led to 40 years of happiness." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Vincent said firmly. "You were brave enough to run. I was smart enough to help. And we were both wise enough to choose each other every day for 40 years. That's not luck, my love. That's commitment." Caroline and Vincent lived long, full lives. When Vincent passed away at the age of 82, Caroline held his hand and told him he'd been the best partner, the best father, the best man she'd ever known. He'd smiled at her with those kind eyes that had first offered her safety and whispered, "Thank you for running in my direction." Caroline lived another 5 years after Vincent's death, surrounded by family, secure in the knowledge that she'd lived a life that mattered. She passed peacefully in her sleep, and at her funeral, her children and grandchildren told stories about the woman who had been brave enough to run from a forced marriage and wise enough to accept help from a cowboy who'd offered his name. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch they'd built together, under the endless Arizona sky they'd both loved. Their headstone was simple, just their names and the dates they'd lived, but underneath was carved a sentence that summed up their entire relationship. She was running from a forced marriage at dawn. The cowboy hid her and offered his name. She gave him her heart. Together, they built a legacy. And in the ranch house below, their great-grandchildren played in rooms that had been built with love and determination, living proof that sometimes the best love stories begin with an act of desperation and the kindness of a stranger who becomes everything.